In a mansion frozen by grief, where laughter hasn't echoed in years, two little boys live trapped in silence, Noah and Ethan, twins born deaf, whose mother died the day they came into the world. Their father, William Carter, a billionaire shattered by loss, believes nothing can reach them until a new housekeeper arrives. Aaliyah Johnson, a warm-hearted woman with no titles or fame, steps into their lives. And something changes. One song, one dance, one moment in the kitchen will break through years of sorrow and silence. But what if that moment is only the beginning? Stay with us to discover how healing can come from the most unexpected places. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, can love really bring a family back to life? Aaliyah had been in the Carter mansion for just over 2 weeks, long enough to understand the rhythm of silence that seemed to govern the household. The children rarely came near her, choosing instead to sit quietly in their chairs or wander the hallways with their eyes lowered, lost in a world no one seemed able to enter. William himself was more of a presence than a participant in the life of his children, moving like a shadow between his office and the upstairs rooms, speaking only when necessary, his words precise and brief. That morning had been no different, and Aaliyah had felt a certain frustration building in her chest as she prepared lunch. She had grown up in a noisy household where laughter and music filled every corner, where even disagreements had been loud, colorful, and human. The Carter mansion, by contrast, felt hollow. On impulse, as she stood in the kitchen and watched the twins sit at the small table without expression, she reached into her bag and pulled out the little speaker she always carried. Without overthinking it, she pressed play, letting a song by Aretha Franklin burst softly into the room. The melody was warm, alive, full of soul. She expected nothing, maybe even resistance, but instead, something shifted. Noah looked up first, his brows furrowing, his lips moving as though forming a question. Ethan, sitting beside him, blinked rapidly, then began tapping his heel against the chair leg. The sound seemed to thread itself into them, and Aaliyah's heart jumped when a giggle, small and fragile, escaped one of the boys. Her instincts told her not to stop. She put the speaker on the counter and began to sway her hips in time with the rhythm, exaggerating her movements just enough to be playful. "Come on, little men," she said, her voice bright and teasing, though she knew they could not hear her words in the way she intended. She moved closer to them, exaggerating the beat with her arms, spinning once in a circle. Noah tilted his head, then mimicked the smallest part of her movement by rocking his torso forward and back. Ethan slapped his tiny hands on the tabletop, then slid off his chair clumsily and stood, his knees wobbling, eyes wide with something close to joy. Aaliyah gasped, but covered it with a laugh, clapping her hands once to encourage him. "That's it, sweetheart. Yes, just like that." She twirled again, letting her braids follow the motion, and when she glanced back, she caught Noah sliding down from his seat too, determined not to be left behind. Their movements were awkward, unsteady, and so far from graceful, but it didn't matter because they were moving. They were reacting. They were alive in a way she hadn't seen before. She knelt slightly, dancing on their level now, encouraging their steps. Noah's giggles grew louder, bouncing off his brother's shy but eager attempts to copy. Ethan stomped his little feet, and his laughter, thin, high-pitched but real, sent a sharp ache through Aaliyah's chest. She found herself smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. The more she moved, the more they responded. Aaliyah decided to test the bond forming in those few moments. She bent low, picked up Ethan's small hands, and guided them side to side like a dance partner. He resisted for a second, then relaxed, looking up at her with wide eyes that almost glowed with pride. Noah tugged at her skirt, impatient not to be left out, so she freed one hand and took his as well, swaying with both boys as though they were a trio on a stage only they could see. "See? We're dancing. You feel it, don't you?" she whispered, though she knew words were not what carried the meaning. Her expression and touch did. The boys laughed again, clear, unguarded, contagious. Noah tried to spin in a clumsy circle, almost falling, but Aaliyah steadied him, lifting him back upright. "You're all right, baby. Try again." She exaggerated a spin herself, and this time both boys clapped, a sharp, imperfect rhythm that matched the beat faintly spilling from the speaker. For years, they had ignored toys, ignored games, ignored the well-meaning attempts of strangers who tried to break their silence. Yet here, now, they were reacting as if the music had always been inside them, waiting for the right person to unlock it. The kitchen had transformed into something no therapy session had ever achieved. Noah lifted his arms like an airplane, wobbling from side to side, while Ethan attempted to copy Aaliyah's swaying hips, his tiny body jerking out of sync, but full of determination. She laughed with them, not at them, her joy feeding theirs in an endless loop. "That's it, explorers," she whispered, kneeling again, her forehead nearly touching Ethan's as she mirrored his stomp. He giggled, louder this time, a pure sound that rang through her in a way that made her eyes sting. Noah rushed to her other side, clapping in rhythm with the beat, and then all three of them were caught in the loop of motion and laughter. She felt her chest tightening with something she hadn't expected to feel so quickly: attachment. In only 2 weeks, she'd been trying to find the crack in their shell, the one spark that might connect them. And now, here it was. Music. It wasn't about hearing in the traditional sense. It was vibration, rhythm, movement, connection. They could feel it, and so could she. For the first time since she had arrived in the Carter mansion, she believed these boys were not unreachable. They were simply waiting for the right rhythm to guide them out of their shadows. It was in the middle of this impromptu dance that William walked in. He had intended only to grab a file he had left on the counter earlier, his mind still spinning with the details of a business deal, when he stopped dead at the sight before him. The file slipped from his hand without him noticing. Noah and Ethan were not withdrawn, not staring blankly at walls as they usually did. They were moving, laughing. Ethan's head was thrown back in unrestrained joy, his hands still wrapped tightly around Aaliyah's fingers as though afraid to let go. Noah stumbled into her side, clutching her arm for balance, but laughing all the same. The sound, the sight, hit William with such force that his breath caught. His children were laughing. His sons, who had spent 3 years locked in silence, were dancing clumsily in the middle of his kitchen, their tiny feet stomping in time to a song he hadn't heard since his wife was alive. His chest ached with something violent, something long buried. Hope. He wanted to move, to step into the room, to demand how this was happening, but his feet refused. All he could do was stand there, rooted in shock, watching the impossible unfold. He didn't even realize his hand had lifted to his chest until he felt his fingers press against the sharp ache spreading there. The scene before him blurred for a moment, as if his mind couldn't process it. Aaliyah twirled once more, then bent low to look into Ethan's face, her smile radiant, her voice soft, though William could not hear the words over the rush of his own heartbeat. Noah clapped again, signing something rudimentary with his little hands, and Ethan followed suit, their eyes shining with joy. William's throat tightened until it burned. He hadn't seen them like this, hadn't believed they could ever look like this. For the first time in years, there was life in their eyes, unfiltered, raw and overwhelming, and at the center of it all was Aaliyah, the woman he had barely noticed beyond her duties, now drawing out of his children something that no doctor, no therapist, no specialist had been able to. He felt dizzy with the realization that the silence which had smothered his house had been broken, not by him, but by her. Standing in the doorway, he could do nothing but stare, his chest heavy with shock, grief, and the flicker of a dangerous, long-forgotten hope. The next morning, William woke before dawn, his body restless though he had barely slept, He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows braced on his knees, head bowed as though the sheer weight of memory pressed him downward. No matter how hard he tried to focus on the day's obligations, meetings, contracts, negotiations, one image kept intruding, stubborn and unrelenting. Noah and Ethan laughing, their small feet stumbling to a rhythm only they seemed to understand. He had watched them move as if life had suddenly been poured into their veins. That memory should have filled him with gratitude, but instead it left him shaken. For years, he had been told by specialists, therapists, entire teams of experts that the boys' condition would keep them isolated, their connection to the outside world forever fragile and uncertain. And yet, in a matter of minutes, the household maid had cracked open what they could not. It was exhilarating, yes, but also terrifying, because it meant everything he thought he understood about his sons, about his grief, about the silence that had defined their lives, was no longer solid ground. His chest tightened as though resisting the possibility. He paced his room, replaying the scene over and over, searching for something that would allow him to dismiss it as coincidence, but it wouldn't leave him. It had lodged itself inside him, stubborn as a splinter. He found Aliyah in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Noah and Ethan sat at the small table, their hands busy with toys they usually ignored, but today they tapped the blocks against the wood in something resembling a rhythm. William's throat closed at the sight, but instead of acknowledging it, he latched onto the surge of control that always kept him steady. "Miss Johnson," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the room. She glanced up, her face calm, but her eyes sharpened with awareness. "What exactly do you think you're doing with my children?" His tone carried accusation, as though she had broken an unspoken law. Aliyah set down the knife she'd been holding, wiped her hands deliberately on a cloth, and faced him fully. "I was giving them joy," she replied simply. "They deserve that." William's brows drew together, his jaw tightening. "They don't need tricks. They need structure, therapy, schedules. What you did yesterday, it wasn't treatment. It was reckless." His words landed like a verdict, but Aliyah didn't flinch. She leaned one hand against the counter, steady as stone, and met his glare without hesitation. "With respect, Mr. Carter, joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of." Her words struck like a blow because deep inside, he knew she was right, though he refused to show it. The silence that followed stretched thin, crackling with the tension of unspoken truths. William tried to speak again, to reassert his authority, but the memory of his son's laughing rose unbidden, robbing him of certainty. "You're overstepping," he finally managed, though his voice lacked the steel it usually carried. Aliyah, noticing the hesitation, softened her tone, but not her stance. "I'm not trying to replace the doctors. I'm not even pretending I have their knowledge. But what I can do is see your sons as more than a diagnosis. They are children, Mr. Carter, children who crave connection. Yesterday they let me in. That means something, whether you want to admit it or not." William swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. He was unaccustomed to defiance, especially from someone in her position, yet her words pierced deeper than he cared to admit. He wanted to dismiss her as naive, but the image of Ethan's small hand clutching hers refused to release him. It was a battlefield inside his chest, pride against longing, grief against possibility. He drew in a breath, trying to steady himself, but it came out ragged, betraying the war he couldn't control. Later that morning, William attempted to bury himself in work. He locked himself in his office, papers spread across his desk, numbers and figures demanding attention. Yet every time he picked up his pen, it hovered above the page uselessly, his thoughts dragging him back to the kitchen. He saw Ethan's head tilted back in laughter, Noah's tiny claps, Aliyah's radiant smile as she guided them, his chest constricted with a mix of admiration and resentment. He hated the vulnerability creeping in, hated the thought that someone else could achieve in one moment what he, with all his wealth and resources, had failed to do for years. And beneath that resentment was the raw, terrifying truth. He wanted more. He wanted to see them laugh again, to hear those giggles that had shaken the walls of silence. But allowing that meant opening a door he had kept locked since the day Emily died. It meant risking the possibility of hope, and hope was dangerous, cruel, because if it broke, it would destroy him completely. He rubbed his eyes, frustrated, the pen clattering from his hand as he leaned back in his chair, lost in thoughts he could not silence. When he emerged from his office hours later, the house was quiet, but not in the way it used to be. The silence now carried an undercurrent of expectancy, as though the memory of laughter still lingered. He found himself drawn toward the living room, where Aaliyah sat on the floor with Noah and Ethan beside her. They were stacking blocks, something simple. But what caught William's attention was the way Noah reached out unprompted, tugging gently at Aaliyah's sleeve to draw her gaze. She responded instantly, smiling as she adjusted the tower they were building, guiding his little hand to place the next block. Ethan leaned against her shoulder, watching intently, his small body relaxed in a way William rarely saw. The sight rooted him to the spot. His sons, who often avoided contact, were leaning into her as if she were a fixture of safety. A pang of something sharp and foreign pierced him. Jealousy, perhaps, or shame that it wasn't him they sought out. He turned away quickly, swallowing the lump in his throat, but the image remained etched into him, undeniable proof of something changing beneath his roof. Yet when he sees Noah tug at her sleeve later, seeking her presence, he realizes his fortress of grief has a crack. The woman he hired to keep the house clean may be stirring something far deeper: life. As days passed, the quiet routines of the Carter mansion began to shift, though not in ways William could have predicted. Aaliyah seemed to make every ordinary task into a stage for something more. Folding laundry, once a mindless chore, became a puppet show where socks transformed into characters with high-pitched voices, and shirts became capes that she draped over Noah or Ethan's shoulders as though they were superheroes. At first the boys only watched, puzzled, their small eyes darting between the fabric and Aaliyah's animated face. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their lips curled into smiles, their fingers twitching forward to grab the puppets for themselves. What struck William most was how intentional it all seemed. She never forced their participation. She let them approach in their own time, coaxing rather than demanding. "Mr. Sock says he's tired," she would say, sliding the sock across the folded pile. Noah's tiny hand darted out to snatch it, and Aaliyah laughed, clapping once as though he had won a prize. Ethan, not to be left behind, shuffled closer and reached for another piece of cloth. The house, for so long weighed down by silence, filled with these small bursts of laughter that startled William every time he heard them from another room. Sweeping the floor was no longer a task to clear dust, but became a race that made Noah giggle so hard he collapsed onto the rug. Aaliyah would hold the broom like a baton and declare, "Whoever gets to the corner first wins." Ethan, unsteady but determined, would shuffle forward on his short legs, while Noah darted clumsily to keep up, their tiny feet thumping awkwardly against the hardwood. William once stood at the doorway, arms folded, trying to convince himself that this was chaos, unnecessary disorder in a house that thrived on structure. But as he watched his sons, flushed with effort, signing hurried motions at Aaliyah to continue, his stern expression faltered. Their laughter carried a rhythm that tugged at something in him he couldn't name. Emily had once teased him for being too serious, for never allowing life to get messy. Now, seeing his sons collapse in laughter on the floor, clutching at Aaliyah's legs while she pretended to have lost the race, he realized how starved the house had been for messiness, for life itself. Even washing dishes, which William had never bothered to imagine as more than a necessity, became a spectacle. Aaliyah filled the sink with suds, blowing into them until bubbles floated into the air like shimmering balloons. Ethan let out a small sound, half squeak, half attempt at a word, as he pointed upward, his eyes wide with delight. Noah reached for one, clapping his hands together to pop it, then laughed so hard he nearly toppled over. "Catch it! Catch it!" Aaliyah encouraged, her voice alive with energy as she dipped her hand back into the suds to release another stream of bubbles. William, standing in the hallway just beyond their line of sight, pressed a hand against the doorframe, his jaw tense. Pride swelled in him like a tide, pride in his sons for breaking their own silence, pride in Aaliyah for coaxing them into this joy. But alongside that pride came the sharp edge of guilt. Emily should have been the one standing there, creating these moments. It should have been her laughter echoing alongside the boys, her hands covered in soap suds as she filled the kitchen with joy. Instead, it was Aaliyah. The thought was as painful as it was undeniable. Noah and Ethan began to trail after Aaliyah wherever she went, their once hesitant steps now purposeful. She bent to pick up a basket of laundry, and Noah toddled after her, pulling at the edge until she allowed him to carry one small shirt in his arms like a treasure. Ethan followed close behind, murmuring broken syllables that made no sense but carried intent. He mumbled, pointing at the basket, and Aaliyah crouched down immediately. "Yes, Ethan, that's your shirt. Can you say shirt?" He stumbled over the syllables again, his little face scrunched with concentration until Aaliyah beamed and ruffled his hair. William watched this from the landing above, hidden but unable to tear himself away. His sons were speaking, not clearly, not fluently, but they were trying, because she had given them a reason to. His chest tightened painfully. He wanted to rush down, to kneel beside them and celebrate each attempt. But guilt froze him. He had spent years drowning in work, in grief, convincing himself that silence was inevitable. To join now, when it was her who had opened the door, felt like theft. But Aaliyah didn't treat it as triumph for herself. Each time one of the boys reached for her, she gently redirected their attention back to one another. "Noah, give Ethan the block. Ethan, your turn." She made their bond grow, not just with her, but between them. William noticed the change. The twins, once locked inside themselves even from each other, now began to share. A block passed from one small hand to the other, a giggle answered by another giggle, clumsy words bouncing back and forth. William leaned against the wall, his chest a battlefield. Pride in their progress warred with the haunting whisper that this should not be happening now, not like this. He could hear Emily's voice in his memory, laughing in their old apartment before wealth had hardened him, teasing that their children would be loud and unstoppable. She would never see this, never hear their first clumsy attempts at words. The wound of that truth split open wider every time he saw them laugh. What should have been pure joy carried thorns of pain he couldn't escape. William observed from a distance, conflicted, pride swelling, but guilt whispering that Emily should be the one to see this, not him. The echoes of his son's laughter awakened wounds he thought buried forever. Late one evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the mansion had fallen into its usual hush, Aaliyah lingered in the living room. She was tidying up toys the twins had left scattered across the carpet, smiling to herself at the thought that they had finally grown confident enough to play so messily. As she reached for a ball that had rolled beneath the sideboard, her eyes caught a glimpse of something tucked high on one of the upper shelves. Curious, she climbed on her toes, stretching her arm, and pulled down a silver frame, its edges dulled by dust. She wiped the glass with the hem of her sleeve, and there it was, a photograph of a younger William, smiling in a way she had never seen, his hand entwined with a radiant woman whose eyes sparkled with warmth. Emily. Even though she had never met her, Aaliyah felt she already knew her through the silence that lingered in the mansion and the heaviness in William's gaze. For a long moment, she simply studied the photo, touched by the tenderness captured within it. Quietly, she returned to her task, but before placing the frame back where it had been hidden, she chose a lower shelf, one within sight of the twins. Something told her that they deserved to know this face, to see the love that had existed before them, to understand that their mother was not just an absence, but once a presence, alive and smiling. The next morning, the change was immediate. Noah, wandering curiously through the living room, stopped suddenly before the photo, his head tilted as though he were trying to place the familiar curve of the woman's face. Aaliyah, sitting nearby, watched without interfering, giving him space to process. After a moment, he raised a tentative finger and tapped the glass, then turned to his brother. Ethan toddled closer, squinting at the image, and the two of them stood there in silence, small shoulders brushing. Then Noah, with visible effort, lifted his hands and shaped a clumsy sign. Mama. It was imperfect, hesitant but unmistakable. Aaliyah's chest constricted, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She crouched beside them, her voice hushed but warm. Yes, sweetheart, that's your mama. Ethan's little fingers fumbled to copy the gesture, though his movements were messy, broken pieces of meaning. Still, the intent was there. Both boys stared at the picture, and Aaliyah reached out gently, resting a hand on each of their backs. She was beautiful, wasn't she? She whispered. The boys didn't answer with words, but their faces softened, as though a piece of them recognized the bond, even without memory. When William entered the room moments later, the sight stopped him cold. His sons stood facing the photograph he had hidden away, their small hands raised in the unsteady shape of a word he had never taught them. For a heartbeat, his lungs refused to draw air. He had buried Emily's memory so deeply, convinced that silence was the only way to protect his children from sorrow. Seeing her face out in the open, and worse, seeing his sons reach for it, felt like a wound reopening. "What are you doing?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, carrying accusation rather than the pain that twisted inside him. Aaliyah turned, her expression calm, though her eyes reflected understanding. "They found her picture," she said softly. They knew before I said a word." William's hands curled into fists at his sides, anger rising not at her, but at the helplessness coursing through him. "They don't understand," he snapped. "They don't need to." But even as he said the words, his gaze betrayed him, drawn inexorably back to his sons. Noah turned at the sound of his father's voice, lifted his hands again, and repeated the sign, "Mama." The word he had feared to speak aloud had taken form in their tiny hands, and it shattered him. He tried to look away, to bury the sight under the armor he had worn for years, but his body betrayed him. His throat burned, his eyes stung, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt tears threaten. He had not cried since the day Emily died. Even at her funeral, he had remained stone-faced, convinced that holding it together was the only way to survive. Now, seeing his children name her, claim her, he could no longer hold back. His knees bent as though the weight of memory forced him down, and he crouched beside them, his hands trembling. "Yes," he whispered, the single word breaking on his tongue. "That's Mama." Noah's face lit up at the confirmation, his hand pressing against the glass, while Ethan leaned against William's shoulder, murmuring syllables that came out slurred but carried meaning. The moment should have broken him, but instead it carried something else, a thread of healing he hadn't thought possible. For the first time, he shared Emily with them, not as a ghost to be hidden, but as part of their story. Aaliyah stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold with a reverence she hadn't planned. She could see the storm raging inside William, the struggle between grief and love, guilt and release. But she also saw something else, a crack in the wall he had built so high. Her choice to bring Emily's memory back into the open had been instinct, but now she realized how vital it had been. The boys needed their mother, even if only in memory, and William needed to see that remembering her didn't mean drowning in sorrow. She spoke softly, carefully. "They'll always know she loved them. That's what matters, Mr. Carter, not how much it hurts you." He didn't answer, but his silence was no longer one of refusal. It was the silence of a man who had just been forced to feel everything he had buried. His hand lingered on Ethan's back, a trembling anchor that told her he was holding on not to grief alone, but to his children as well. When Noah points to the picture and signs clumsily, "Mama," William's heart clenches.